Navy warship 121. This is Sepa Navy station. You must alter course and go back to the Indian Ocean immediately. If you don't obey my order, you will be targeted. Out.
Do you think you already understand the Strait of Hormuz? You probably know it as a thin strip of water trapped between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, a tense geopolitical corridor repeated endlessly across news broadcasts whenever oil prices rise. Or another military crisis begins to unfold in the Gulf. A place described almost entirely through statistics, shipping routes, and the language of global anxiety. But that version of Hormuz exists mostly on maps, and maps have a dangerous habit of making fragile things appear permanent. Because the real Hormuz is something far stranger. A world of burning mountains stained red with iron and sulfur. Islands where fresh water is scarce enough to shape entire civilizations around its absence. Coastlines where summer heat becomes so severe that entire communities reorganize life itself around the movement of the sun. Long before supertankers carried the fuel of industrial civilization through these waters, people here were already surviving conditions that should have made permanent settlement nearly impossible. They crossed violent currents in wooden vessels, guided by memory instead of instruments. They built homes designed not against the environment, but around it. And they learned very early that survival in this part of the world belongs only to those willing to adapt. Today, nearly a fifth of the planet's oil supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Economies separated by oceans remain dependent on whether this narrow maritime corridor continues functioning hour after hour without interruption. But the deeper reality of Hormuz has never been about oil. Oil merely exposed how much of the modern world now rests on systems far more fragile than they appear. Because beneath the shipping lanes and military patrols exists an older landscape shaped by pressure in its purest form. Pressure from heat, isolation, scarcity, salt, geography, and time. This is not simply the story of a strategic waterway. It is the story of a place where the environment never stopped testing the people who lived within it. And where survival became so refined over centuries that the modern world eventually built part of its own survival on top of theirs. The Persian Gulf is one of the hottest marine environments on Earth. In summer, surface water temperatures rise high enough to kill coral reefs across most of the planet. Bleaching entire ecosystems into pale, underwater graveyards stripped of color movement, and life. By every conventional expectation of marine biology, the waters surrounding Hormuz should already be collapsing beneath the pressure of heat and salinity. And yet beneath the shipping lanes, beneath the military patrol routes, and oil tankers moving endlessly through the strait, entire reef systems continue to survive in conditions that seem almost biologically impossible. For thousands of years, the reefs of the Gulf adapted to environmental extremes that arrived not as temporary disasters, but as ordinary reality. Heat became part of their evolution. Salinity became part of their chemistry. Generation after generation, the coral that endured passed its tolerance forward until survival itself became embedded within the structure of the reef. Scientists studying these waters are not simply observing marine ecosystems. They are witnessing what adaptation looks like when pressure never fully disappears. The corals of Hormuz survived because they had no alternative except resilience. For fishermen navigating the Gulf before sunrise, the reefs are more than hidden ecosystems beneath the surface. They are orientation systems, invisible structures determining where fish gather, where currents break, where entire food chains begin and end beneath dark water, stretching far below the hulls of small wooden boats. Families along the coast built their livelihoods around these patterns centuries before the world understood how fragile marine ecosystems actually were. In Hormuz, survival has always depended on understanding relationships most people never notice until they begin to fail. But adaptation has limits. Tanker traffic now moves through the strait at a scale no ecosystem evolved to absorb. Oil contamination, industrial runoff, rising ocean temperatures, and military activity place pressures on the Gulf faster than natural systems can respond. The reefs survived thousands of years because change arrived slowly enough for life to adjust itself over time. What threatens them now is acceleration. And places like Hormuz reveal something modern civilization rarely wants to confront directly. Nature can survive hardship for extraordinary lengths of time. What it struggles to survive is the speed of human expansion. Along the tidal coastline of Qeshm Island, where the desert slowly dissolves into shallow channels of warm Gulf water, an entire forest survives in conditions that should make life impossible. The Hara mangroves rise directly from seawater, so saline that most plant species would die within days of exposure. And yet these trees remain rooted in the tides year after year, filtering salt through biological systems refined over millions of years of adaptation. What appears from a distance like an ordinary stretch of coastal vegetation is actually one of the most specialized survival mechanisms in the natural world. At high tide, large sections of the forest disappear partially beneath the water, leaving only twisted trunks and dark green canopy visible above the surface. Boats move silently through narrow corridors between the roots, while sunlight fractures across the channels in shifting patterns of reflection and shadow. The atmosphere inside the mangroves feels strangely enclosed compared to the exposed heat of the Gulf outside. The air softens slightly. Bird calls replace the mechanical noise of distant engines, and for brief moments, the industrial world surrounding the strait seems impossibly far away. But the Hara forest is not wilderness in the romantic sense outsiders often imagine. For the coastal communities living around these islands, the mangroves function as infrastructure. The submerged root systems create nursery grounds for fish, shrimp, and countless marine organisms that later move outward into deeper Gulf waters. Entire fishing economies begin here in silence beneath the tides. Generations of fishermen learn to harvest these waters without exhausting them completely, understanding through experience that survival depended less on extraction than balance. In places shaped by scarcity, excess becomes dangerous very quickly. Today, that balance is becoming increasingly fragile. Expanding coastal construction, pollution from tanker traffic, and warming sea temperatures now place the mangroves under pressures they did not evolve to absorb simultaneously. Unlike storms or seasonal heat, industrial acceleration arrives too quickly for ecosystems built on slow adaptation to respond effectively. And places like the Hara forest reveal something easy to ignore from a distance. The systems most essential to human survival are often the ones almost nobody notices until they begin to disappear. From the air, Hormuz Island does not look natural. Mountains rise from the Gulf in violent bands of red, orange, white, and black, as though the surface of the earth itself had been torn apart and exposed beneath the sun. Iron-rich cliffs collapse into valleys stained with sulfur and salt, while dark volcanic rock cuts through the landscape in fractured ridges shaped long before human civilization existed anywhere near these waters. Under the midday heat, the colors sharpen with such intensity that the island begins to resemble something imagined rather than real, a geological accident too dramatic to feel accidental at all. But Hormuz was not formed gently. Hundreds of millions of years ago, enormous salt domes, buried deep beneath ancient seabeds, began forcing themselves upward through layers of compressed sedimentary rock. Over immense stretches of time, tectonic pressure folded the island into the distorted terrain visible today, exposing minerals usually hidden far beneath the surface. Wind erosion later carved the landscape even further, stripping away softer layers until entire mountains appeared painted directly by the Earth's internal chemistry. Hormuz is not beautiful because it is peaceful. It is beautiful because violence shaped it slowly enough to become permanent. And somehow, people built lives here. Villages emerged between rocky coastlines and dry interior valleys, where survival depended on understanding the environment with extraordinary precision. The island's red mineral soil, known locally as golak, became part of local cuisine, cosmetics, dyes, and trade. The land itself entered directly into culture. In Hormuz, geology was never separate from daily existence. People ate from the earth, built with it, navigated by it, and learned how to survive despite the constant reminder that the island offered almost nothing easily. Today, images of Hormuz spread rapidly across social media and travel platforms, attracting tourists drawn by landscapes that appear almost extraterrestrial. But the island was never designed for mass attention. Fresh water remains limited. Soil systems erode easily beneath uncontrolled development and tourism pressure. And the same geological fragility that makes Hormuz visually extraordinary also makes it vulnerable. Places like this reveal a pattern repeated across the modern world. The moment something rare becomes globally visible, the race to consume it often begins faster than the environment can protect itself from being changed forever. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is barely 21 miles wide, a distance small enough that, on clear days, the opposing coastlines seem almost close enough to touch. And yet, through this confined corridor, moves an amount of energy so vast that much of modern civilization quietly depends on its uninterrupted flow. Every single day, massive crude carriers carrying nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply drift through shipping lanes carved tightly between coastlines shaped by heat, salt, and geopolitical tension. Entire economies rise and fall according to whether these waters remain stable enough for movement to continue. From satellite images, the traffic resembles an organized machine. Endless rows of tankers crossing the Gulf in disciplined formation beside patrol vessels, cargo ships, and military fleets operating under constant surveillance. But from the surface of the water, the strait feels far less controlled. Heat haze distorts visibility across the horizon. Currents shift unpredictably beneath the hulls of ships large enough to carry millions of barrels of crude at a time. And every captain navigating Hormuz understands a reality the rest of the world rarely considers directly. There is almost no margin for error here. But for the fishing communities living along the strait, these waters are not primarily symbols of global tension. They are workplaces. Fishermen launching before dawn read the Gulf differently than economists or governments do. They study wind direction, wave behavior, tide movement, and seasonal migration patterns inherited through generations of observation long before satellite systems monitored the strait from space. The same corridor, carrying the machinery of industrial civilization, also carries ordinary human survival on a much smaller scale. And both systems now exist uncomfortably close to one another. Hormuz became strategically essential, partly through geography and partly through coincidence. Vast oil reserves emerged around one of the narrowest and most controllable maritime corridors on Earth, forcing the global economy into dependency on a place never built to support such pressure indefinitely. And perhaps that is the deeper contradiction hidden beneath the strait. Modern civilization often presents itself as vast, diversified, and stable. But in reality, enormous portions of the world still depend on narrow passages, fragile enough to disappear behind a fingertip on a map. On Qeshm Island, life does not move according to the clock. It moves according to the sun. By late morning, during summer, temperatures climb high enough to bend the horizon itself. Warping roads and coastlines beneath layers of rising heat until the landscape appears submerged beneath invisible waves. Humidity from the Gulf settles over the island with suffocating weight, turning the air into something that feels less breathable than wearable. Metal burns to the touch. Concrete radiates stored heat long after sunset, and outside, during the hottest hours of the day, even standing still begins to exhaust the body. So the island learned to adapt. Before sunrise, entire communities accelerate into motion during the brief window when physical labor remains possible. Fishermen push boats into the water while darkness still hangs above the coast. Markets open early, compressing activity into a few survivable hours before the streets empty beneath the afternoon heat. Construction slows. Doors close. Entire neighborhoods retreat indoors almost simultaneously. To outsiders unfamiliar with the Gulf, the silence can appear lifeless. But this is not inactivity. It is environmental negotiation, refined through generations of experience. The architecture of Qeshm reflects the same understanding everywhere. Homes are positioned to intercept prevailing winds from the sea. Walls remain thick, not for decoration, but for thermal insulation against relentless sunlight. Narrow alleyways curve through older villages in ways designed specifically to maximize shade throughout the day. Even windows are shaped according to heat exposure and airflow. Nothing evolved accidentally here. In places where climate can become physically dangerous, survival eventually reshapes the structure of entire societies. Modern infrastructure has altered part of this relationship. Air conditioning now cools shopping centers, offices, and newer residential developments across the Gulf. But dependence on mechanical cooling introduces another vulnerability entirely. Power failure during extreme heat can transform sealed buildings into traps within hours. The older systems survived because they worked with the environment rather than attempting to overpower it completely. And places like Qeshm reveal something modern civilization still struggles to accept. Technologies built against nature often require constant maintenance to survive. Technologies built around nature can continue functioning long after the societies that created them begin to disappear. Along the northern coastline of Qeshm, the village of Laft rises from the edge of the Gulf in pale stone and compressed alleyways shaped by centuries of exposure to heat. Above the rooftops, tall rectangular structures stand against the sky with open vents facing different directions, like silent mechanical instruments frozen in place. From a distance, the wind towers appear almost ceremonial, remnants of an older world preserved for tourists and photographs. But the towers were never decorative. They were built because survival demanded them. Inside the older homes, beneath these structures, the difference becomes immediate. Outside, the Gulf heat presses against walls hard enough to empty streets by midday. Inside, air moves slowly downward through vertical shafts engineered to capture passing wind above roof level and distribute it throughout the building below. The system functions without electricity, without motors, without modern machinery of any kind. Geometry alone creates circulation powerful enough to reduce interior temperatures dramatically, even during the most brutal months of summer. The towers work because generations of builders learned to understand air itself as a material that could be shaped. For families living in these homes centuries ago, failure in design carried consequences far beyond discomfort. A badly ventilated building in the Gulf climate could become physically dangerous, so architecture evolved through pressure instead of aesthetics. Every opening, corridor, and wall thickness reflected accumulated environmental knowledge refined slowly across generations. The result was not primitive engineering waiting for modernization. It was an advanced survival technology developed under conditions where mistakes were punished immediately by the environment itself. Today, glass towers and air-conditioned developments dominate much of the modern Gulf skyline, consuming enormous amounts of energy to artificially recreate conditions older communities achieved passively through design. Across the region, cities built around permanent climate control continue expanding deeper into environments that remain fundamentally hostile beneath the infrastructure supporting them. And places like Laft expose a contradiction hidden inside many modern ideas of progress. Civilization often assumes newer systems are automatically superior to older ones, but sometimes the most intelligent technologies are the ones built by people who understood they could never fully separate themselves from the limits of the environment around them. In the coastal boatyards of Hormuz and Qeshm, the sound arrives before the shape does. The sharp rhythm of hammers striking wood beneath open-air shelters facing the Gulf. Long planks of timber bent slowly into curved hulls by heat, pressure, and human instinct rather than industrial machinery. At first glance, the process appears almost impossibly fragile compared to the steel cargo ships dominating the strait beyond the shoreline. But for centuries, vessels like these carried merchants, fishermen, divers, and entire trading networks across the Persian Gulf, long before modern shipping routes transformed Hormuz into one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. The traditional lenge boats of the Gulf are not constructed from printed blueprints or digital measurements. Most master builders carry the proportions entirely in memory, passing knowledge from father to son through repetition instead of documentation. The angle of the keel, the curvature of the hull, the distribution of weight across the frame. Every decision comes from experience accumulated over decades of working with the sea directly. Many craftsmen can identify imbalance simply by walking around an unfinished vessel in silence. The knowledge exists physically inside the body before it exists anywhere else. These boats evolved specifically for Gulf conditions. Their structure was shaped by shallow coastal waters, unpredictable currents, seasonal storms, and long trade routes stretching toward India, East Africa, and the Arabian coast. European navigators entering the region centuries ago documented the vessels repeatedly because they understood something important immediately. The people of Hormuz already possessed maritime systems refined through generations of adaptation to one of the most difficult waterways in the region. The sea here rewarded precision and punished arrogance very quickly. But traditions survive only as long as the world continues creating conditions where they remain necessary. Industrial manufacturing now produces cheaper fiberglass vessels faster than handcrafted wooden construction can compete economically. Younger generations leave coastal villages for urban work, disconnected from maritime life entirely, and international regulations increasingly favor standardized industrial systems over inherited local practices. Places like the Hormuz boat yards reveal how entire forms of human intelligence disappear quietly, not through war or destruction, but because modern civilization gradually stops making room for the knowledge that once allowed people to survive within the environment itself. Across the islands and coastal settlements surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, color appears where outsiders least expect it. Against landscapes dominated by salt, stone, and relentless sunlight, women's clothing emerges in deep blues, crimson reds, gold embroidery, and layered fabrics carrying patterns passed through generations. To distant observers, the garments are often reduced to symbols of regional tradition or religious identity, but like many things in Hormuz, their origins begin not with ceremony, but with survival. In environments where the sun itself becomes a long-term physical threat, even clothing evolves under pressure. The traditional face coverings worn across parts of the Gulf developed first as protection against light reflected violently from the sea and surrounding salt flats. Over decades and lifetimes, exposure damaged skin and eyesight for people working outdoors beneath temperatures capable of turning ordinary labor into exhaustion. So the coverings adapted accordingly. Structured masks shielded the most vulnerable parts of the face while still allowing movement, visibility, and breathability within oppressive heat. Practical necessity slowly transformed into cultural language. Over time, the details began to matter. Stitching patterns, colors, shapes, and materials started communicating information recognizable immediately within local communities. Marital status, regional background, family identity, social standing. The masks became more than environmental tools. They became part of how society read itself. In Hormuz, survival and culture rarely remained separate for long. Repeated adaptation eventually embedded itself so deeply into daily life that necessity began to resemble art. But modernity changes traditions by altering the conditions that originally made them meaningful. Across much of the Gulf, younger generations increasingly grow up inside air-conditioned cities, disconnected from the environmental pressures that shaped older forms of dress. Global fashion replaces local symbolism. Industrial life reduces dependence on climate-adapted clothing systems refined slowly across centuries. And places like Hormuz reveal how fragile cultural continuity can become once survival itself no longer forces people to remember why traditions existed in the first place. Sometimes, a civilization does not lose its identity through conquest or collapse. Sometimes, it disappears quietly beneath comfort. On the northern edge of the Strait of Hormuz, where the mountains of the Musandam Peninsula collapse sharply into the sea, there is a village so isolated that for centuries the outside world arrived only by boat. Kumzar sits enclosed between stone and water, separated from the modern Gulf by geography harsh enough to preserve something almost nowhere else survives anymore. A language belonging entirely to itself, neither fully Arabic nor Persian, neither Indian nor Portuguese, but fragments of all of them fused together through centuries of trade, migration, empire, and isolation until an entirely new way of speaking emerged from the movement of the sea. Kumzari was not invented intentionally. It accumulated. Merchant sailors crossing the strait left behind words. Colonial fleets introduced others. Traders arriving from India and East Africa added new layers over generations until the vocabulary of an isolated fishing community became a living archive of every civilization that once passed through Hormuz without fully staying there. In most places, such linguistic fragments eventually dissolve beneath dominant national languages. But isolation protected Kumzar long enough for the language to root itself deeply into identity before modernity could erase it completely. For the people who speak Kumzari, the language is not treated as historical preservation. It is simply reality. Children inherit it at home before learning Arabic in school. Fishermen carry it onto the water before sunrise. Families continue seasonal movement patterns between coastlines and inland settlements, following environmental rhythms older than modern borders themselves. The language survived because the geography surrounding it forced continuity long after the outside world had already begun changing. But isolation rarely survives contact with the modern world indefinitely. Younger generations increasingly leave for larger Gulf cities, where economic opportunity depends on integration into national systems and global communication networks. Smartphones replace oral continuity. Urban life replaces maritime rhythms. And slowly, the environment that once protected Kumzari begins dissolving beneath modern connectivity. Places like Kumzar reveal something civilization often notices too late. Languages are not only collections of words. They are entire systems for understanding reality. And once a language disappears, the particular way its people once saw the world, disappears with it forever. Long before oil transformed the Gulf into the center of global energy politics, the Strait of Hormuz already controlled something civilizations considered equally valuable: movement. Every ship traveling between the Indian Ocean and the wealthy interior markets of Persia, Mesopotamia, and Arabia was forced through these narrow waters. Trade routes carrying spices, silk, pearls, horses, metals, and textiles all converged at the same geographic bottleneck. And once a place becomes important enough to influence commerce between continents, empires eventually arrive, believing control of it can reshape history itself. When Portuguese fleets entered the Gulf during the 16th century, they immediately recognized what Hormuz represented: not merely an island or maritime corridor, but leverage. Fortresses rose above the coastline in stone and cannon fire as European powers attempted to dominate trade flowing through the strait. Taxes were imposed on passing ships, naval patrols expanded across the Gulf. Entire commercial systems were reorganized around military control of the waterway. But conquering Hormuz was never as simple as occupying territory on a map. The environment itself resisted permanence. Heat exhausted foreign soldiers unfamiliar with Gulf summers. Freshwater shortages limited expansion. Supply routes became vulnerable across harsh coastlines, where the sea could shift from calm to violent without warning during seasonal storms. Even maintaining military control required surviving conditions. Local communities had already spent centuries adapting to long before outsiders arrived. The geography surrounding Hormuz shaped empire as much as empire attempted to shape Hormuz. And across generations, control repeatedly shifted between dynasties, colonial powers, regional kingdoms, and modern states without ever fully stabilizing for long. Today, the architecture of power surrounding the strait has changed form, but not logic. Naval destroyers replaced wooden fleets. Surveillance systems replaced watchtowers. Oil replaced spices as the resource moving through the corridor. Yet the pressure surrounding Hormuz never disappeared because the geography never stopped mattering. Places like this expose one of history's oldest patterns. Certain landscapes become too strategically important to remain peaceful indefinitely. And once enough of the world depends on a single location, that place stops belonging entirely to itself. It becomes part of the machinery holding entire civilizations together, whether the people living there ever wanted that responsibility or not. In much of the world, climate change is still discussed as a distant possibility, a future crisis described through projections, conferences, and statistical models safely separated from everyday life. But along the shores surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, many of those future conditions already exist in the present. Extreme heat is not theoretical here. Water scarcity is not emerging. Environmental instability is not approaching slowly from the horizon. The people living across these islands have spent generations adapting to pressures much of the modern world is only beginning to experience for the first time. Summer temperatures across the Gulf continue rising toward levels that push the limits of human survivability outdoors. In some coastal regions, Humidity combined with heat creates conditions capable of exhausting the body with dangerous speed even during ordinary physical activity. Entire cities now depend on desalination plants, converting seawater into fresh water through massive industrial systems operating continuously beside the coast. Without them, millions of people could not remain here at all. The line separating natural environment from engineered survival grows thinner every year. And yet, beneath the infrastructure of modern Gulf cities exists an older reality that developed long before industrial technology arrived. Traditional communities across Hormuz learned to survive scarcity by adjusting themselves to environmental limits rather than attempting to eliminate those limits entirely. Architecture evolved around airflow instead of permanent artificial cooling. Seasonal movement patterns adapted to temperature shifts. Water was stored, rationed, and protected with extraordinary discipline because survival demanded it. Older systems endured precisely because they accepted instability instead of assuming control over it. Modern civilization often behaves differently. Energy-intensive infrastructure creates the impression that environmental pressure can be permanently neutralized through technology alone. But dependence creates its own fragility. Power grids fail, supply chains break, desalination systems require constant operation, and the more artificial stability expands into hostile environments, the more catastrophic interruption becomes when those systems falter. Places like Hormuz reveal a possibility the modern world still struggles to confront honestly. The future may belong less to societies capable of dominating nature, and more to those capable of surviving when domination stops working. For outsiders watching the Strait of Hormuz from a distance, the region often appears defined entirely by crisis. News broadcasts reduce it to military tension, oil prices, sanctions, and the possibility of conflict spreading across the Gulf. But for the people who actually live along these coastlines, instability is not an interruption to normal life. It is normal life. Generations here grew up understanding something much of the modern world only recently began rediscovering. Stability is temporary. Survival depends on preparing for the moment it disappears. In the fishing villages scattered across Hormuz and Qeshm, life still follows rhythms shaped more by tide, heat, and wind than by the systems dominating global headlines. Men repair nets beneath shaded alleyways, while children move between houses designed to trap passing air from the sea. Families store water carefully because abundance was never guaranteed long enough to become trusted. Older traditions continue not because communities resist modernity, but because environments this harsh punish waste, arrogance, and forgetfulness very quickly. In places where conditions can turn dangerous within hours, knowledge becomes survival before it becomes culture. What makes these communities remarkable is not resilience in the romantic sense, often celebrated by outsiders. It is precision. The accumulated understanding of exactly how much heat the body can tolerate, how long supplies can last, when currents become dangerous, and which environmental signals must never be ignored. Entire ways of life emerged from the necessity of paying attention continuously to conditions the outside world often notices only during emergencies, And over centuries, that attention shaped architecture, language, labor, food, migration, and identity itself. Today, smartphones glow inside homes built around survival principles older than industrial civilization. Tankers carrying the machinery of the global economy pass villages where people still navigate the sea through inherited memory rather than digital systems alone. And perhaps that is what makes Hormuz feel so unsettlingly important. It exists simultaneously in multiple eras at once, a place where ancient forms of adaptation continue surviving beneath the infrastructure of a modern world, increasingly discovering how fragile its own assumptions about permanence may have always been. The modern world likes to imagine itself as vast, diversified, and secure, a civilization protected by scale, technology, and systems complex enough to absorb almost any disruption without collapsing entirely. But the Strait of Hormuz reveals something far less comforting. Beneath the appearance of global stability, enormous parts of human civilization still depend on places so geographically small they can disappear behind a fingertip on a map. A narrow corridor of water, surrounded by heat, salt, rock, and tension, now carries the pressure of economies, governments, supply chains, and entire populations far beyond the Gulf itself. And yet Hormuz was never designed to hold that weight. Long before oil tankers crossed these waters, the people living here already understood something industrial civilization forgot too easily. Survival does not come from permanence. It comes from adaptation. Coral reefs survived because they adjusted to extreme heat over thousands of years. Mangrove forests survived because they learned how to process salt instead of resisting it. Villages survived because architecture evolved around climate rather than against it. Even culture itself changed shape under pressure until language, clothing, food, and labor all became reflections of an environment that never allowed comfort to become permanent. Perhaps that is why the Strait feels increasingly unsettling in the modern age. Not because it is uniquely fragile, but because it exposes how fragile everything connected to it has become. The global economy depends on uninterrupted movement through waters that remain politically tense, environmentally vulnerable, and physically narrow enough for disruption to spread outward across continents within days. Entire societies built around assumptions of endless stability now rely heavily on places where instability has always been part of ordinary life. And maybe that is the deeper truth hidden beneath Hormuz. The people who survived here for centuries never believed the environment owed them safety. They built systems capable of enduring uncertainty, because uncertainty was the only constant they could trust. The modern world often behaves differently. It assumes control will continue indefinitely, that systems will hold, that the flow of energy, trade, water, and stability will never truly stop. But places like Hormuz remind us how dangerous it becomes when civilization starts believing its own illusions.